What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today, and happy Tuesday. The United States of America will look a lot different tomorrow because tonight, as we all know, is the first release of the College Football Playoff Committee's top 25 rankings. So make sure you're following at CFB Kings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football, especially tonight as we get to see the CFP top 25 and where everybody stands in regards to the new expanded 12-team playoff format. Week 10 was a wild one. We had 7 ranked teams lose, 1 in the top 3, 2 in the top 10, and 4 in the top 11, and that committee has a lot on their hands in determining tonight's rankings. Let's get right into Ohio State's victory over Penn State because as much as things in our sport seem to constantly change, some things stay the same. The Buckeyes defeated the Nittany Lions for an 8th consecutive time, and Saturday's game just felt like a copy of so many of their other meetings. I tweeted during the game, I was sitting there watching it, and came to this realization that this game is the exact same thing every single year. Penn State almost always has an early lead, then they blow it, and then it's a one-score game in the fourth quarter. It looks like the Nittany Lions might have a shot still. Then they make some play that ends up costing them the game, and Ohio State wins. And not only is that game always the same, Penn State's 2024 season looks like a duplicate of any of 2023, 2022, 2019, 2017. They usually beat the teams they're favored over, but when it comes time to finally get over the hump and become a contender, they just never seem to do it. And of course, there were a number of times during this game where it looked like Penn State had the advantage. It was a super tight game. It's not like they got blown out or anything. There were a couple of controversial calls, a couple of crazy turnovers, but no matter what, they just can't seem to win the big ones. For Ohio State, they earned a massive win on the road over a top 3 opponent, and that was the first time they had beaten a top 3 team on the road since 2006, and this was Ryan Day's just second win over a top 3 team. And the NIL-powered Buckeyes have kept their Big Ten title hopes alive. If Ohio State and the Indiana Hoosiers continue to win over the next couple weeks, they will basically have a play-in game for the Big Ten championship on November 23rd, where the winner would likely end up facing Oregon, and if that's Ohio State, they get a rematch to avenge that loss that they had to the Ducks earlier this year. Penn State only dropped to number 6 in the AP poll after the loss, which doesn't matter now with the CFP rankings coming out tonight. And to be completely honest, the last 3 AP polls have been so awful that I don't even really give it any credence anymore. So we'll see where the committee has them, but they're still looking all right for a CFP spot for now. Louisville upset number 11 Clemson 33-21 in Death Valley on Saturday, which is the first time the Cardinals have ever beaten the Tigers in program history. They were previously 0-8 all-time against Clemson. This game was an odd one, but the writing was also kind of on the wall in a couple ways. If you watch the Week 10 preview episode, I mentioned Louisville running back Isaac Brown against Clemson's rushing defense and how the Cardinals had a major edge there. I was so confident in that matchup that I took Brown's rushing total over 62.5 yards, which we'll touch on at the end of the episode. But he rushed for 151 yards on Saturday night in Death Valley. And this guy's just a freshman too, by the way. He was extremely impressive. Clemson had major trouble stopping him, and Louisville's offensive line scheme was giving the Tigers a lot of problems as well. Despite Brown's performance, Clemson actually outgained Louisville in total yardage. Clemson had more passing yards, they had more rushing yards, they had more first downs, they had fewer penalties, but they were simply outcoached. There was a point in this game where Louisville led 26-7 by 19 points, a 3-possession game in the fourth quarter where Clemson didn't seem to know or care that time was rapidly ticking off the clock. I tweeted while I was watching that it genuinely looked like they were trying to run out the clock on themselves. It looked like they had just completely forgotten what to do. They were taking like 30 seconds in between plays. They were huddling down by 19 in the fourth quarter. There was just absolutely zero urgency, and it was very bizarre. Then they scored a touchdown, and with like 2 minutes left, they got the ball again, and all of a sudden they were in this turbo mode, tempo offense that was running plays like crazy, and the announcers pointed it out and said, well, where was this when it was actually still a game, and they could have had the opportunity to potentially put together a couple quick drives to get back in it. There were also 2 different occasions where Clemson scored and could have gone for 2 to try to make it an 11-point game. So a touchdown and 2-point conversion, and then a field goal could be an option to tie it. And they kicked the extra point to stay down by 12 both times. It literally looked like Clemson was trying to lose the entire second half of this game, and just made zero sense. Another way that the writing was on the wall here is that for whatever reason, Clemson plays horribly, coming off a bye week almost every year, which is like the most backwards thing possible in football, but it's true. So coming off a bye week in 2024, they lost 33-21 to Louisville. Coming off a bye week last season in 2023, they lost 28-20 to Miami. Coming off a bye week in 2022, they got just rocked 35-14 by Notre Dame. And coming off a bye week in 2021, they barely beat Syracuse 17-14. It's very odd, but they really play their worst game of the season every year after getting rested coming off a bye week. It makes zero sense. I don't know what the explanation for that would be, but it's a consistent 4-year pattern of them just looking like they have no idea what they're doing after a full week to rest up, a full week to game plan for whoever they're playing, and they just come out flat every time. Another major part of the game was that Louisville blocked 2 of Clemson's field goal attempts, which again goes back to the Cardinals outcoaching the Tigers, because Louisville came into the game with multiple blocked field goals, and Clemson came into the game having multiple field goals blocked, and they didn't do anything to fix that or plan against it. The Cardinals improved to 6-3, bowl eligible, and they finally beat a ranked team. I've mentioned it a few times before, but the Cardinals' 3 losses are each by 7 points, and they're to Miami, Notre Dame, and SMU, and they easily could have won a couple of those, but they finally got it done on the road at Clemson. This shakes things up a bit in the ACC and CFP races, with Clemson no longer controlling their own destiny. They're still third in ACC standings, but they now need either SMU or Miami to drop a game in conference play, but and then even if that happens, they need some tiebreaker circumstances to go their way as well in order for them to be in contention for that ACC championship game. In a strange coincidence, and for all I know, this may be the first time that this has ever happened, but we had 2 teams tied for number 11 this week in the AP poll, and both of them lost. Texas Tech took down number 11 Iowa State on the road in Ames, and my Big 12 champion pick Red Raiders are still alive. I mentioned it in the last episode in the Week 10 preview, but my pick of Texas Tech for the Big 12 title was largely because of the confidence that I had in running back Taj Brooks and some of the transfer portal additions that they had in the wide receiver room as well. Washington State transfer Josh Kelly was a beast for Texas Tech in this game. He had his best performance of the season against their toughest opponent so far, putting up 8 receptions for 127 yards and 2 touchdowns. Running back Taj Brooks continued to dominate. He now has over 100 rushing yards in all 8 games that he's played this year. Every time he's suited up, he's rushed for over 100 yards. He had 122 and the game-winning touchdown in the final seconds to lift the Red Raiders past the Cyclones. For Iowa State, this is just their first loss of the season. They came into Week 10 undefeated, and they're one of the teams I'm most interested to see if the committee has a major discrepancy with in comparison to the AP. The AP dropped 1 loss Iowa State to number 17, but like I said before, the poll has been atrocious lately, so we'll see what the committee does with them. The Cyclones are still second in the Big 12 standings for now. I'm actually not sure what their tiebreaker situation is with Colorado, who also only has 1 loss in conference play, and they don't play each other head-to-head. But the Buffaloes have a road trip to Texas Tech next week, so a loss there would simplify things a lot for Iowa State. Texas Tech has 2 losses in conference play, but they have a head-to-head win over Iowa State, which means that they just need the Cyclones to lose 1 game against any of Arizona State, Cincinnati, or Kansas State. And then, like I mentioned, Texas Tech plays Colorado next week and can jump them with a head-to-head win. So both teams still very much in Big 12 title contention. This game also had one of the craziest win probability charts of the week and really one of the most roller coaster looking ones of the season. Just a very entertaining game that was back and forth. It looked like Iowa State had it won at points. It looked like Texas Tech had it won. The Red Raiders needed a 4th down conversion on their final drive before going down to score with 20 seconds left, and all around just a phenomenal game. In a less suspenseful game, South Carolina blew out number 10 Texas A&M 44-20 on Saturday night, and much like Louisville, after several close losses to ranked opponents this season, the Gamecocks finally put it all together and got it done. South Carolina ended this game on a 27-0 run, and there just wasn't anything at all that Texas A&M could get going in the second half. The Gamecocks outgained them by 179 total yards. They had 7 more first downs, they forced more turnovers, they had less penalties, and played the all-around better game. This is only Texas A&M's first loss in conference play, and I believe they still control their own destiny with all the games that they have left and tiebreaker stuff. But this is their second loss overall because they lost to Notre Dame in week 1. So like Iowa State, and actually more similar to Clemson with 2 losses, it'll be interesting to see what the committee's view of them is and where they're ranked tonight. South Carolina improves to 5-3 overall, and they now have a really interesting matchup on the road at Vanderbilt next week. Number 20 SMU just absolutely blasted number 18 Pitt on Saturday night in Dallas. They were about a touchdown favorite, but this game was never close. They led 31-3 at the half. They led 48-18 at one point, and ultimately won by 23. But this was a major statement game for the Mustangs. In just their first season since moving up from the Group of 5 to the Power 4, SMU is undefeated in ACC play. They're tied for first in the conference with Miami. Their only loss overall is by 3 points to BYU, who is one of the final 5 remaining undefeated teams in the sport, and now they're heavily in contention to make the college football playoff. On the flip side, everything that went Pitt's way last week against Syracuse went the exact opposite for the Panthers in this game against SMU. I was watching this, and it felt like one of those nights where absolutely nothing would go their way. Every time it felt like they might potentially get a stop on defense, SMU would just make a wild play. I think SMU converted like a 3rd and 18 at one point. Every time it felt like Pitt's offense had some momentum, they'd turn it over. They were 5 of 16 on third downs. They couldn't extend any drives. And mainly that was due to a lot of what SMU's defense was throwing at them, but also because of some self-inflicted mistakes. These are both teams that I'm also very interested in seeing the committee's perception of, because this was Pitt's first loss. They're 7-1, and SMU's 7-1 as well. And they've just been on fire since that close loss to BYU toward the beginning of the year, so it'll be nice to figure out where they both stand in the eyes of the committee. One of the bigger shockers of the week was that number 17 Kansas State lost to 3-5 Houston, 24-19. This was a wet, rainy, very sloppy game, and one that K-State actually led by 9 points in the fourth quarter, but a turnover and a late rally really helped lift the Cougars to victory. This was one that had a wild win probability chart as well, like that Texas Tech-Iowa State game. Definitely not as back and forth, not as roller coaster looking, but this was a really tight game that Kansas State had control of for almost the entirety of it. And then things just fell off a cliff after a 41-yard touchdown run by Houston quarterback Zion Chris to take the lead with 2:31 remaining. Chris had a phenomenal game, and this is the first time that I've seen this all season, and minimum 10 passes. I don't know when the last time this happened was, but he was 11 of 11 passing, 100% completion percentage for 103 yards and a touchdown, and then also had 22 carries for 75 yards and a touchdown on the ground. And despite Chris's dual threat effort, Kansas State outgained Houston by over 100 yards, but they fumbled a snap on a field goal, which led to a scoreless drive. And they threw an interception deep in their own territory, which led to a quick, short field scoring drive for the Cougars. And this loss most likely knocks Kansas State out of at-large playoff contention, but also really makes the Big 12 standings interesting because even with the loss, they're still 4th due to head-to-head wins. But they're right there in that mess with BYU, Iowa State, Colorado, and Texas Tech. And I mentioned it earlier, but they still play Iowa State. So a very fun finish setting up there in the Big 12. A couple other interesting scores. Number 2 Georgia escaped Florida 34-20 in a really odd game in Jacksonville. Florida looked strong early. Their defense was all over Carson Beck. They forced 3 interceptions, but unfortunately for the Gators, they lost their starting quarterback DJ Lagway. And if you remember back to the Florida-Tennessee game a couple weeks ago, the Gators were already without their original starter, Graham Mertz. ESPN's Pete Thamel made a report yesterday that Lagway's injury wasn't as bad as it initially looked when he was carted off the field, but he might be able to return later this season, but he missed about 2.5 quarters of that Georgia game where it looked like they had some momentum early. So the Gators were playing with their third-string quarterback, their backup running back. They were missing their best defender, their best wide receiver, and had several more players go down during the game, but despite being very injury-riddled, this was a tie game with 5 minutes left. This was 2020 until Georgia scored 2 touchdowns in a minute after third-string quarterback Aiden Warner threw an interception deep in the Gators' own territory. Georgia continues to be one of the most inconsistent teams in the country. They dominated Clemson by 31 points in Week 1, and then nearly lost to a Kentucky team that is 3-5, I believe. They lost to Alabama. They trailed that game by 28 at one point. They gave up 31 points at home to a 2-win Mississippi State team, and then went and beat Texas on the road, and now they have another extremely sloppy performance against a hobbled Gators squad. The Dogs have the potential to be one of the best teams in the country, and they're also a team that's a couple plays away from being 5-3 with losses to teams who have a combined record currently of 13-13. So just a really tough team to figure out. Number 13, Indiana steamrolled Michigan State 47-10, and they finally trailed in a game, though, for the first time all season. They were actually down 10-0 in this game, and then scored 47 unanswered points. Coach Sig had an awesome tweet after the game. If you're listening on podcasts, he just said, "I guess we know how we'll respond when behind." The Hoosiers ranking tonight will also be a fun one to see in terms of how the committee looks at their schedule, but also the fact that they just murder everyone. One game that was understandably off of everyone's radar was North Carolina at Florida State, but this one was pretty interesting. Omarion Hampton was an absolute beast. I'll save his stats for later because he's a king of the week. But yeah, he was unreal. But UNC beat FSU 35-11. The reason that I wanted to talk about this game was that the Tar Heels have quietly been improving week after week after week, and they're starting to put things together. This team lost their starting quarterback in week 1 and had been playing with 3 different guys for a while. But Jacoby Criswell has really settled in over the past 4 weeks. He has 982 yards and 5 touchdowns, and then also 132 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns just in those last 4 games. And they obviously don't have any CFP or ACC title hopes or anything, but the significance of Criswell's play, combined with how insane Omarion Hampton is that North Carolina's remaining schedule is Wake Forest at home, at Boston College, NC State at home. They've been one of the least talked about teams in the country, but there's a real possibility if they can keep their current momentum that North Carolina can finish 8-4 and on a 5-game win streak heading into bowl season. And another interesting note from this game was that this is the first time Mack Brown has ever beaten his alma mater, Florida State. He was a combined 0-11 in his career at both Texas and North Carolina, but finally got a win over the Noles 34-11 on Saturday. And lastly, number 5 Miami beat Duke 53-31 in a deceivingly fun game. 53-31 doesn't quite do this game justice in terms of how close it was for a while. This was 32-31 with 13 minutes left in the game, but the Canes just exploded in the fourth quarter and did so in historic fashion. On a 66-yard touchdown pass from Cam Ward to Xavier Restrepo that helped Miami pull away, Restrepo became the Canes' all-time leader in career receptions and career receiving yards. He now has 182 receptions and 2,573 yards in his career at Miami, and on Saturday he surpassed some of the Miami greats like Michael Irvin, Reggie Wayne, and Santana Moss with his 146-yard performance against the Blue Devils. He needs 8 touchdowns in order to pass Michael Irvin's program record of 26 receiving touchdowns, and should the Canes make a playoff run, he might get the opportunity with a couple more games to capture that record as well. Alright, I mentioned it at the beginning of the episode, but this is usually where the rankings reaction segment has been, but with the Sunday AP poll no longer being the main source of rankings and the CFP Top 25 coming out on Tuesdays, rankings reaction will be at the beginning of the Thursday episode from here on out. And before we get to Kings of the Week, I did briefly want to touch on last week's picks. We went 6-3 with a bunch of solid hits. I had Texas Tech plus 13.5. They got the outright win over Iowa State. And then I also had Texas Tech's first quarter team total over 0.5 points. They got that one for us with a real quick touchdown. I had Louisville running back Isaac Brown over 62.5 rushing yards at Clemson. He had 151, best bet of the week there. Just touched on the game a minute ago, but I had North Carolina minus 2.5. The Heels dominated the Noles 34-11. And then I had Arkansas tight end Luke Hasz over 22.5 receiving yards against Ole Miss. He had 77. And lastly, I had Miami's money line. I took it live during that game as soon as they went down by 11 points to Duke because I got it at some decent odds. But they trailed 28-17, and I just had a feeling that they'd pull out the win. The misses of Week 10 were Clemson tight end Jake Brenningstool over 0.5 receiving touchdowns. He had a reception and got tackled at like the 3-yard line, I believe. So close there, but didn't hit. I had Texas A&M minus 2.5 over South Carolina. Just way off on that one. I thought the Aggies would carry the momentum from last week, and that the Gamecocks might come up short against another ranked opponent, but yeah, they certainly did not. And then I had Memphis -7 over UTSA. They got beaten badly by the 3-5 Roadrunners, and that was one of the more strange results from Saturday's games. All right, now it's time for Kings of the Week, a segment where I highlight some of the best performances across the country each and every week. First up, we have FIU wide receiver Eric Rivers. I made note of this one to make sure that it wasn't forgotten about, because on Tuesday night against New Mexico State, Rivers had 11 receptions for 295 yards and 3 touchdowns, averaging 26.8 yards per catch. Those 295 receiving yards are a single-game program record at FIU. Also, during the midweek games on Wednesday night, Jacksonville State running back Trey Stewart had 27 carries for 232 yards and 4 touchdowns on Liberty. He was given the ball 27 times, averaged 8.6 yards per carry, and had every Jacksonville State touchdown in this game. Just an absolute workhorse performance from Stewart. Speaking of a running back carrying a team, and I actually think they both wear the number 28, but Omari and Hampton was unbelievable for North Carolina on Saturday against Florida State. And given UNC's record so far, like I talked about earlier, Hampton really hasn't gotten much attention, but he's been insane. Against the Seminoles, he had 32 carries for 172 yards and 4 touchdowns. And then for good measure was also the Tar Heels' leading receiver with 3 receptions for 93 yards and a touchdown as well. He touched the ball 35 times in this game, accounted for 265 total yards, and all 5 of North Carolina's touchdowns. And lastly, we have a duo from Ole Miss, and this is the first time that I've done this all season, but it is well deserved because Jackson Dart and Jordan Watkins were on another level on Saturday afternoon against Arkansas. Dart was 25 of 31 for 515 passing yards and 6 touchdowns, and then also led the team in rushing with 10 carries for 47 yards. So 562 total yards, 6 touchdowns for Dart. And then 5 of those passing touchdowns that he had were thrown to Jordan Watkins, who had 8 receptions for 254 yards and 5 touchdowns, 8 catches, 5 TDs. He averaged 31.8 yards per catch and was absolutely unstoppable. That's going to wrap up this episode of the CFB Kings Show. I really appreciate you making it all the way to the end. And I can't wait to see the CFP committee's rankings tonight because we finally get to see where everyone actually stands, and all of the speculation and stuff about what the CFP race looks like can get some real structure to it. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, and follow if you're listening on Spotify. And definitely make sure to check out @CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.